I have never been one of those people who believe in conspiracies or become obsessed with crazy theories. I always thought that most of them were exaggerations or pure inventions. But what happened to me on that trip to Alaska still leaves me awake at night, questioning everything I thought I knew. The worst thing is that I was not there looking for anything strange. It was just a business trip. I am a telecommunications engineer, and the company had sent me to a remote station to review equipment. A secluded place in the middle of nowhere, with snow-covered mountains and silence so heavy that it seemed to swallow everything around. Only that it was there, in this forgotten piece of the world, that my life changed. I arrived in the early afternoon. The sun was already setting, because at this time of year the days are short. After checking the systems at the station, I decided to take a walk to stretch my legs before returning to the accommodation. That's when I noticed something strange in the landscape. I can't explain, but it seemed like the mountains had a design that didn't match, as if a part of them had been altered. It was subtle, but I had been to many remote places and knew when something was not natural. I continued walking, driven by curiosity, until my feet sank in the snow near a partially covered hole. It looked like some kind of entrance, but it was badly disguised, as if someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. A bad feeling took hold of me at that moment, but at the same time, something pulled me to continue. I should have turned around right there, but you know that feeling that you can't ignore something so out of the ordinary? So that's exactly what made me approach that hole. The air there seemed heavier, as if the temperature had fallen a good degree, although I was in the middle of a snow desert. When I got closer, I realized that the hole was not just a hole. It was an entrance, rectangular, with two smooth edges to be natural. There were marks around like heavy machinery, but everything was covered by a thin layer of ice and snow, as if it had been abandoned for some time. I knelt, trying to spy inside, but all I saw was darkness. Suddenly, a muffled noise came from inside the entrance, as if something metallic was being dragged. I froze. It wasn't my imagination, I was sure of it. The sound got louder, as if it were coming towards me, but I couldn't see anything. It was then that I felt the strangest thing, a slight vibration on the ground, as if something was moving under me. My heart popped. I decided it was time to leave there. But when I got up, I realized that there was something in the distance on the horizon lights. They weren't normal, or from a vehicle or something. They were green, pulsating in an irregular way, as if they were trying to attract me. Against all common sense, I started to walk in that direction. As I walked towards the lights, everything around me seemed different. The sound of the wind, which was once constant and even comforting, disappeared. It was not just silence, it was a strange void, as if the world had turned off the sound. My boots made the typical noise in the snow, but even that seemed muffled, as if someone had put a pillow around each step. The green lights pulsed faster and faster, almost mesmerizing, and I felt as if I was being pulled by them, even without understanding why. My rational side was screaming for me to come back, but my body just didn't obey. It's hard to explain. I just kept going. After walking for a few minutes, which seemed like hours dash, I finally reached the place where the lights came from. It was a gigantic structure, partially covered by snow and ice. It was nothing I expected to find there. It looked like a building, but completely different from any construction I had ever seen. The walls were made of some kind of dark metal, which did not reflect the light of the lanterns, but the green lights came from inside, coming out through small cracks. I stood there, trying to understand what it was, when I noticed something that made me shiver from head to toe. There were footprints in the snow. Large, disproportionate, as if something huge had recently come out of that structure. I followed the footprints, but without the courage to get too close. They were too big, but what really bothered me was the shape. They didn't look like anything I had ever seen. They looked like hands, with elongated fingers and claws at the end, but the spacing between them was strange, as if something walked awkwardly or with multiple limbs. Each footprint was at least twice the size of my foot. As I watched, I realized that they didn't lead anywhere. They started at the entrance of the structure and disappeared, as if the thing had simply vanished into thin air. That didn't make sense. The snow around was untouched, no signs of digging or movement beyond that. My instinct was to leave, but something made me look back at the structure. The green lights were more intense now, blinking irregularly, almost like a code. It was when I noticed a very low sound coming from inside, almost like a buzz. It didn't seem natural, nor mechanical. It was as if the air itself were vibrating. I decided to take a few steps back, trying to process what was happening when something made me freeze. The hum stopped for a moment, and silence again took over the place. But in the middle of all this, I heard a completely different sound, something breathing. It wasn't my breath. It was slow, heavy, and seemed to come from somewhere very close. The sound of breathing was so close that I could almost feel the air moving around me. My whole body jammed. I couldn't move, as if something was holding me in place, even though there was no one there. I looked around, trying to identify where it was coming from, but everything around me seemed empty. It was when I noticed a detail that almost made me lose my balance. The steam of my own breath, which until then was visible because of the cold, simply stopped appearing. As if the air had been static, suffocating. I knew something was with me, but it was not in the field of view. When I finally gathered the courage to take a few steps back, I heard another sound. It was not the breath this time, but something dragging in the snow right behind me. I turned my body so fast that I almost fell, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible, at least. The problem is that, where I was looking, the snow seemed distorted, as if a heat wave had passed by there. It didn't make sense, because the temperature was freezing, but it waved like hot air on the asphalt. At that moment, the green lights in the structure behind me began to flash in a frantic pattern, faster than before, and the buzzing returned, this time so loud that I had to cover my ears. I knew I couldn't stand there any longer. Every fiber of my body was screaming to run, but my legs looked like lead. Finally, I forced myself to take one step, then another, trying to get away from that distortion in the air. It was then that something happened that I cannot explain until today. The snow around began to move, as if something gigantic was crawling under it, but there was no depression, no crack. Just the constant muffled sound of something huge moving. My heart popped, and I started running without looking back, but it was as if the wind itself was against me. With each step, I felt an invisible weight trying to pull me back. When I finally got far enough away from the structure, the green lights blinked one last time and went out, leaving everything in the pitch. The buzzing ceased, and for a moment, only the sound of my own panic filled the void. The wind returned, and the normal sound of snow under my feet seemed almost comforting, but the feeling that something was watching me didn't go away. I looked back and saw the landscape returning to normal, or at least it seemed. The entrance I had found before was completely covered with snow, as if it had never existed. Don't know how I got back to the lodge that night. All I know is that, even today, I avoid thinking about what happened. I didn't tell anyone else here, because honestly, I don't even know what I saw. I just knew it wasn't normal. Crash and capture. I never been much about it, but there are nights when this memory does not let me sleep. Do you know when a noise in absolute silence makes you jump out of bed? That's what has happened to me since that day. I was a reconnaissance pilot, and at the time I was on an operation involving flying over territory that officially did not exist. Everything was calculated to the extreme. Route, time, even the weather. My job was to collect data without anyone noticing that I was there. On that particular day, everything was going well. It was clear, no turbulence, and my instruments were working perfectly. Until, out of nowhere, everything started to go wrong. First, my panels started flashing like they had life of their own. Altimeter, speed, fuel consumption, nothing made sense. I thought it was some kind of interference, but before I could react, an absurd flash lit up the cabin. It wasn't like lightning or a lighthouse. It was a solid light, so strong that it seemed to cross the fuselage. 1 second later, my plane started to shake like it was being torn in half. I don't know how I survived the impact. Just remember waking up with the feeling of free fall. My ears were buzzing, and I had no idea where I was. When I realized that I was falling, I saw the parachute. It was pure reflex, because in my head I was already dead. The landing was hell. I fell into a place covered with snow, with sharp winds that made my face burn. My hands trembled so much that I could barely release the hoists of the parachute. I was still trying to understand what had happened when I heard the first sound. It was like an engine, but muffled, almost imperceptible. Turned my head and saw something that made me freeze. Lights on the horizon in formation coming towards me. They were not rescue lights or anything familiar. They were pulsating, half orange, and seemed to float in sync. Before I could react, I heard voices. I could not understand what they said, but they were direct, fast, almost like commands. When I looked again, they were there. At least a couple of dozen men, all dressed in white, with masks covering their faces. They pointed guns at me while speaking in English, but it was hard to understand with the noise of the wind. I tried to raise my hands, show that it wasn't a threat, but before I could say anything, they were already on top of me. They handcuffed me and put me in an armored vehicle, which seemed to have come out of nowhere. I knew they were not on my side, and the feeling that I was completely screwed only increased. My body was shaking, but this time it wasn't just the cold. Something was very wrong with all that. Inside the vehicle, their silence was what scared me the most. No one said a word. Just the sound of the engine and the constant swing kept me aware that I was still there, but I did not know where I was going. They had blindfolded me as soon as I entered, so my only perception was the environment. The smell of oil, the cold metal of the bench, and the vibrations of the floor. After a while, I began to feel that we were coming down. The air seemed heavier, as if we were entering somewhere closed deep. I had heard stories about places like this, facilities that should not exist, but never imagined that I would end up in one of them. When they finally took the blindfold off, my heart almost stopped. He was in a gray corridor, no windows, with white lights flashing intermittently on the ceiling. There were armed men in all directions, and the silence was almost worse than in the vehicle. I was pushed forward through metal doors that automatically closed behind us. Everything seemed too clean, too organized, as if it was made to be never seen by anyone. There was no sign, nothing to indicate where I was. After several turns and long minutes, They put me in a room without windows, with walls so smooth that they seemed to repel any sound. There, they left me alone. Fear took over. I had no idea what they wanted or what would happen next. I was not alone for long. Soon the door opened, and a man entered. He wore a black suit impeccably, seemed to be about 50 years old, with an expression so cold that it seemed to have no emotions. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me as if he was trying to read my mind. Then finally he broke the silence. "Who are you and what were you doing there?" It was the only thing I said, but in such a calculated way that he seemed to know the answer before I even spoke. My mouth was dry, and I could barely organize my thoughts. What should I say? Tell the truth? Lie? I decided to go for the basics. I said my name, my rank, and that my mission was just reconnaissance. He laughed, but not in a normal way. It was as if he was mocking, knowing that I was hiding something. After that, an endless string of questions began. Who sent you? What did you see? Why were you so close to the perimeter? The problem is that I myself did not know how to answer most of them. Everything had happened too fast. I tried to explain the flash of light, how my instruments failed, and how my plane was shot down, but he seemed not to believe a word. Worse, he seemed more interested in what I was not saying. At each answer, he would tilt his head slightly, as if he was analyzing everything with an almost inhuman precision. After a while, he left the room without saying anything more, and again I was alone. Silence returned, but this time it seemed more suffocating. I felt that it was far from over. Don't know how long I was in that room, but eventually they came back. This time, it was 2 armed men and the same guy in a suit. They said nothing, just picked me up and took me out. As we walked through the endless corridors, I noticed something strange, the sounds around. It was not just steps or doors closing. It was something more. A distant, low sound, almost like a muffled scream coming from somewhere deep. With each step, it became harder to ignore. As we turned a corner, I saw a series of lined doors, all reinforced with huge latches and small windows on top. I passed one of them and swore that a shadow was moving in there. It was quick, but enough to leave me with a chill on my spine. They took me to another room, bigger and brighter. In the center, there was a table with something covered by a dark cloth. The man in a suit approached, pulled out the cloth, and revealed something that seemed impossible. It was a twisted piece of metal, but not common. It had a strange texture, almost as if it were alive, and reflected light in a way that seemed to change color constantly. He asked me with a firm voice, "Have you seen this before?" I immediately denied it, but I don't know if he believed. Whatever it was, it seemed important to them. That's when I realized I wasn't the priority there. Something bigger was at stake, something they thought I had seen or knew. After I denied knowing that object, they exchanged quick glances, almost imperceptible, and took me out of the room without saying anything more. The guards escorted me back down another corridor, but now the environment seemed different. It wasn't just my paranoia. The muffled screams I had heard before were louder, closer, and not just human. Something in that base was alive, something it should not be. I passed through more reinforced doors, and in one of them, I saw something I will never forget. Through the small window there was a human figure, but his eyes were completely black, with no expression, and his head was tilted in a strange way. When I looked closer, she moved fast, hitting the glass hard. I jumped back, and the guards pushed me to keep walking, as if that was something normal for them. Finally, we got to an elevator. They put me inside and pressed a button without looking in my eyes. I didn't know if it was going up or down, but I was sure it wouldn't be a good thing. When the doors opened, I was thrown into a room with a small mattress and a cold light that blinked intermittently. I stood there alone, listening to the echo of those scary sounds getting lost in the hallways. I never knew how long I spent there. It could have been hours or days. When I woke up, the door was open and there was no one in sight. The base looked abandoned, but that sound of screams and things moving was still there. I didn't wait to find out what had happened. I ran out and somehow found the way out. To this day, I don't know how I managed to escape, but what I saw there will never leave my head. Life inside the Fez. I never thought my life could change so fast. One day, I was just another pilot performing classified missions, and the next, I was locked in a place that looked like a nightmare. The name I heard the staff using was the Fez, but it wasn't like they gave me a tour or explained where I was. It all started after that accident. My plane crashed by something I still can't explain. I woke up in a small cell, with metal walls so smooth that it seemed impossible to build. The cold light blinked intermittently, and the silence there was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a heavy silence, which made you feel as if the air itself was suffocating you. The first days were a blur of interrogations and isolation. They asked questions I couldn't answer, things about my accident and what I had seen. I was telling the truth, that I didn't know what had happened, but it seemed that no one believed me. Gradually, I began to understand what that place really was. It wasn't just a prison. It was much more than that. I heard sounds coming from the hallways, screams, machine noises, and sometimes something that seemed inhuman. It was not the kind of thing you hear in a normal hospital or laboratory. It was something that stirred with you, that made your skin shudder just to imagine what was happening behind those locked doors. Over time, things began to change. I don't know if it was because they realized that I really didn't know anything, or they just thought I wasn't a threat. They took me out of that tiny cell and put me in a bigger room with a decent bed and a small table. It was not luxury, but at least I could breathe without feeling that I was buried alive. It was there that I began to notice more details about the place. Whenever I moved through the corridors, I saw more reinforced doors with small windows, but what was behind them was what really scared me. Sometimes I saw shadows moving, things too big to be human. And the sounds, I'll never forget the sounds, like something scratching metal or muffled grunts, as if they were from an animal that should never exist. It was at this stage that I met Kevin, one of the scientists who worked on Fez. He was different from the others. He seemed more human, closer. While most employees ignored me or avoided eye contact, Kevin always tried to talk to me. He said that he had no idea why I was there, but his curiosity was genuine. Gradually, we began to create a kind of friendship. He brought me books to read, and sometimes even let slip small details about what happened in that place. He was the one who told me that Fez was not just a scientific facility. It was a kind of repository for things that couldn't be explained. That alone was enough to keep me awake at night. The friendship with Kevin was what kept me sane in that place. He never went into too much detail about what he was doing, but the few things he said were enough to make me shiver. He mentioned experiments, anomalies, and talked about creatures that should never exist but were there alive. He seemed uncomfortable, as if carrying these secrets weighed on him. He once told me that some of the things on that base were not the result of human experiments. He said that in a low voice, almost as if he was afraid that the walls themselves could hear. It was in this conversation that he let slip that even the scientists there did not understand everything they were dealing with. It only made me more terrified. There was a strange routine in that place. Sometimes they let me walk through the halls escorted, and it was on these occasions that I saw things I preferred to forget. Once we passed a room with a glass window. Inside, there was something alive. He looked human, but his arms were abnormally long, and his eyes were completely black with no pupils. He was standing, staring at the glass as if he could see me, even with all the security protocols between us. I couldn't take my eyes off it until one of the guards pulled me. Kevin later explained to me that it was just one of many special projects of Fez. The casual way he said it gave me chills. I wondered if they really had control over those things. As time went on, I began to realize that not everything in that place was as controlled as they wanted it to look. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing muted alarms and screams coming from afar. They never explained what was going on, but Kevin seemed increasingly tense. One night, he visited me in my room, something he never did outside of his regular hours. He seemed nervous, even scared. "Avoid the corridors of Sector B," he said, without giving further details. The problem is that my room was exactly in Sector B, and that night I could not sleep. I sat in bed, trying to understand what he meant when I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. It wasn't human, that I was sure. Something was moving outside, and for a moment I was sure that it would open the door. Nothing happened, but the sound was recorded in my mind. When I saw Kevin the next day, he seemed exhausted. I asked what was going on, but he just shook his head as if he could not or did not want to explain. It was on that day that he started to tell me more about what was going on in Fez. He spoke of a special compartment on the lower level, where they kept things that they did not fully understand. Creatures that had no explainable origin, phenomena that challenged all the laws of physics, and objects that were kept under constant surveillance because nobody knew exactly what they did. "This place is a repository of errors," he said. "Errors that no one should have created or encountered." After that conversation, everything became more strange. Kevin started to avoid talking to me, and the few moments we met, he seemed distracted, as if he was carrying a huge weight. One afternoon, as I walked through the corridors, I felt something different in the air. It was almost a vibration, as if the place itself were alive. As I passed through one of the reinforced doors, I heard a low but steady sound, like a hum mixed with something resembling a whisper. One of the guards pulled me to go on, but at that moment I realized it wasn't just Fez holding me. It was what was inside him. I can't explain, but I felt that if I left there, something would not let me go very far. It was that night that everything got out of control. I woke up to a shrill sound, a mix of alarm and muffled screams. The light in my room was blinking like crazy, and the floor was shaking slightly. For a moment, I thought the whole building would collapse. When the door of my room opened, I expected to see a guard, but it was Kevin. He seemed desperate and said only one thing: "You need to get out of here." Before I could ask how, I heard a sound that I will never forget. It was like a roar, but it didn't look like any animal I knew. Kevin pulled my arm and took me out of the room, no matter for the alarms or guards who were probably on their way. Kevin guided me through corridors I had never seen before. The place seemed even more claustrophobic than usual, with flashing lights and that roar that seemed to echo from all sides. We passed through an open door that led to a narrow tunnel, and it was there that I saw something that even today makes me wake up sweating cold. At the end of the corridor, there was a shadow. It was huge, but it didn't make sense. The thing seemed to move in a fluid way, like smoke or water, but with a weight that made the ground vibrate. Kevin pulled my arm hard and whispered, "Don't look back." My urge to run was strong, but my legs barely moved. I just kept walking because the fear was greater than fatigue. When we finally reached what appeared to be an emergency exit, Kevin stopped. He put something in my hand. It looked like a key, but it was different, metallic, with a strange glow. "If you can get out of here, use this," he said, and before I could ask what that meant, he pushed me out. The cold outside was a shock, but the silence was even more disconcerting. I ran without looking back, until my lungs burned and my legs no longer responded. When I finally stopped, I looked at the horizon and realized that there was nothing. No installation, no light, only snow. Fez had disappeared. To this day, I don't know what happened to Kevin, and the key he gave me is still in the safe. I never had the courage to use it. Strange and the unknown. I always thought I had a good sense of what was real and what wasn't. I grew up listening to science fiction stories and watching movies about aliens and crazy experiments, but that was just entertainment, nothing more. After being taken to the forum, this line between reality and fiction began to disappear. In the first months, I thought it was just a prisoner, someone they wanted to interrogate and then ignored. But gradually I realized that it was not quite so. Fez was more than a prison. It was a place where science, fear, and the impossible mixed in ways I never imagined. It all started with the sounds, screams, buzzing, and a kind of echo that seemed to come from something alive, but unlike anything I had ever heard. The first time I was taken to one of the containment areas, I thought it was some kind of test to intimidate me. I passed through seemingly endless corridors with reinforced steel doors and small windows on top, like those in prison cells. When we got to a bigger room, they told me to look through glass. At first I thought there was nothing in there. It was just an empty room with white lights flashing. But then I saw. It was human, or almost. He had arms and legs, but they were too long, and his skin was so translucent that you could see something moving underneath her, like living veins or something. When he looked at me, his eyes had no pupils, only a black glow that seemed to pull you. I have never felt so much fear in my life. After that day, I began to realize that the place held secrets far more disturbing than anything my mind could comprehend. The creatures, or test subjects, as they called them, were not just results of genetic experiments. Some of them just didn't make sense. Once, I heard a conversation between two scientists walking down my hallway. They talked about something called Zone 17, a sector where the missing were kept. I did not quite understand what that meant until the day when, accidentally, I was taken to a corridor that seemed to be closed. The guard who was with me hesitated, but we went ahead. When we passed through an observation window, I saw a group of people, or at least it seemed, sitting on the floor, motionless, staring at nothing. His clothes were torn and his eyes had an empty glow, almost as if they were no longer human. I asked the guard what that was, but he just shook his head and mumbled something about recoveries. Later, Kevin, the scientist who sometimes talked to me, confirmed what I suspected. Those people were not ordinary prisoners. They were given as missing in places where, theoretically, no one should be. The strangest thing, according to Kevin, was how they were found. Some appeared in mountains where they could never have climbed alone. Others were seen hundreds of miles from their place of origin, without explanation. They just appear, he said, without looking into my eyes. And when they get here, it's not us who control what they become. I wanted to believe he was exaggerating, but after seeing the emptiness in those faces, I knew there was something very wrong with it. Kevin tried to explain to me more about what they were studying there, but it seemed like even he didn't have all the answers. Some things just don't fit our comprehension, he said once, almost as if thinking aloud. It was at this time that I began to notice strange patterns in the things they showed me. For example, there was a creature they called Subject Alpha. It wasn't human, but it didn't look like any known animal either. His skin was a grayish-brown tone, with a texture that reminded wood, but the most bizarre was the way he moved. There were no visible joints, and yet it slipped as if floating. They kept the Alpha locked in a room with reinforced walls, and yet everyone was tense as they went through it. It was on another occasion during one of these escorted walks that I saw something that I still cannot explain. We were passing through a room that seemed more technological, full of equipment and monitors, when I noticed a strange artifact in the center of the environment. It was a kind of golden cube, with inscriptions that did not seem to be from any human language. When I asked the guard what it was, he did not answer, but Kevin, who was nearby, said to me softly, "Nobody touches. Everything that comes near dies." He didn't seem to be joking. Later I learned that the cube was responsible for more than a dozen fatal incidents. They didn't know where it came from, only that it had been found in a cave in Alaska. This made me wonder if that place was just a deposit of dangerous things, or a hole where they threw everything they could not explain. The more time I spent in Fez, the more I realized that it was not just a deposit. It was a place where they tried to understand things that were beyond our comprehension, and this scared me more than any creature or object. One night, I woke up with a strange sound, something like metal bending. I left my room, escorted by a guard who seemed as scared as I did, and we passed through an area that was normally closed. It was when I saw something that I will never forget. An entire room was destroyed, the walls crumpled inside, as if something gigantic had tried to get out of there. In the center, there were burn marks on the floor and footprints, but they weren't human. They were huge, with 3 elongated fingers and something that looked like deep claws. When I asked Kevin what he could have done, he just looked at me, visibly shaken. "You don't want to know," was all he said before changing the subject. Days later, I heard about a creature they called Echo. No one knew exactly what it was, but the descriptions left me cold. They said that it could only be seen with infrared equipment, but that sometimes it could be heard, a low sound, like an echo, where the nickname came from. Kevin mentioned that a group of scientists once tried to study him closely, and without explanation, they all disappeared into the room. When the rescue team entered, all they found were hand marks on the glass, as if someone had tried desperately to get out. After all this, I began to realize that no one really controlled Fez. They tried to keep a facade of order, but fear was in every corner of that place. Even the guards, who were always rigid, began to show signs of nervousness. One night, as I was walking through the halls, I heard someone scream. It was a short cry, followed by such a heavy silence that even the sound of the lights seemed louder. The guard who was with me stopped, held firmly on the gun, and said not to move. Then came the noise, something scratching the ground. We couldn't see anything, but it was like something was right there in front of us. We stood still until the sound disappeared. The guard pulled me back, mumbling something about not being trained for this. The last thing that really broke me was what happened in the containment sector. One day, They took me to watch another room, something they had done a few times before. But this time it was different. There was nothing inside, at least it looked like it. Kevin was there, and I noticed he was more restless than usual. He told me to pay attention, because something could appear. Minutes passed in silence, until something began to form in the air, like smoke taking shape. It was impossible to describe. It seemed human, but at the same time wrong. It had strange proportions, as if it was between two states of existence. Kevin started to slowly back down, and one of the scientists in the room control shouted to close the containment. Before they could react, the thing disappeared. Nobody said anything after that, but I knew everyone was terrified. Friendship with Kevin. When I was taken to Fez, I did not know that my life would be reduced to an endless cycle of routine, fear, and silence. I can't say exactly how long I was there. The days were mixed, and artificial lights made it seem as if time had stopped. I had no one to talk to, other than the few words exchanged with the guards, who seemed as bored as I was scared. It was only months after I met Kevin, and honestly, he was the only thing that kept me in that place. Kevin was different. He was one of the scientists in the facility, but he did not have the calculating coldness of others. There was something human in it, a kindness that was at odds with everything that place represented. Our first meeting was brief. I was being transferred between areas, and he was next to a group of scientists, holding a tablet that seemed full of incomprehensible information. He looked at me and, instead of ignoring others, nodded his head, almost as if to give me some comfort. That night, he appeared in my cell with a book in his hand, something that seemed out of place in that environment. "I thought you might use this," he said, in a calm tone but full of sympathy. It was the beginning of something that not only gave me hope, but also made me question everything I knew about friendship and humanity. Kevin started to appear regularly. He said that he needed a break from the endless reports and experiments that filled his days. He sat in the chair on the other side of my cell and, without ceremony, began to speak. At first, it was about trivial things, the food of the facility, the weather outside, childhood stories. But soon he started to open up in a way that caught me by surprise. Kevin had lost his son in a car accident years before, something he could barely speak without looking away. Shortly after, his wife died of cancer, which left him completely alone. He said that he took the job at Fez because he thought he had nothing more to lose, but there were days when he seemed to regret being there. What really stuck me about Kevin was the way he saw the world, or rather, the universe. He had this philosophical view that the universe was a tapestry of complexity that we humans were unable to fully comprehend. He sometimes talked about the possibility of intelligent life outside of Earth, but not in the way you see in the movies, with aliens invading and destroying everything. If they were smart enough to get this far, he said, they don't need war. They would infiltrate, study, perhaps even live among us. He believed that the extraterrestrials, if they existed, would be more artists and philosophers than warriors, interested in creating and understanding, not in destroying. It was fascinating to hear, but also disturbing, considering where we were. As time went on, our conversations became deeper. Kevin brought books and sometimes even old movies, saying they were cultural treasures that no one else cared about. He loved to discuss how humans had an obsession with creating narratives of destruction, especially when the subject was aliens. Have you ever noticed how we always think that we are the center of the universe? As if everything that comes from outside was automatically a threat, he said, gesturing with enthusiasm. To him, if an advanced civilization wanted to study us, they would do it discreetly. They could be here already, mixed in, writing books, painting pictures, or even talking to someone like me. He laughed at that part, but I didn't think it was so funny. The way he said those things made me feel that he knew more than he let on. One night, Kevin showed up with a bottle of brandy, something that was clearly not allowed there. "Don't worry, nobody comes here at this hour," he said with a smile. He looked different that night, more relaxed but also loaded with a certain melancholy. That's when he started talking about his life before Fez, as if he was unloading everything at once. He told how he used to take his son fishing, and how his wife loved to cook on the weekends. "I used to think I had everything, and in a matter of 2 years, I lost everything," he said, looking at the bottle in his hand. It was the first time I had seen him so vulnerable, and it hit me. That place seemed to suck the soul of everyone, but Kevin still had something that connected him to what was human. That night, Kevin started rambling on about what he believed made us human. He said that creativity and curiosity were the greatest marks of intelligence, and that if there were other intelligent life forms, they probably shared these characteristics. "They don't need weapons," he said, turning the makeshift cup in his hand. "If they can travel the universe, then they are on a level we cannot even imagine. They would study, create, learn, but never in an obvious way. They would be discreet, invisible even." He paused for a moment and looked at me in a way I had never seen before, as if trying to decide whether or not to say something. "What if they are already here?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "What if we're living side by side with them without noticing?" The silence that followed was heavy. I could not sleep that night, thinking about what he had said. Kevin seemed so sure, so convinced, that it was hard to ignore. In the following days, he started to bring bits of information about the experiments on Fez, as if he was preparing me for something. He spoke of objects that challenged the laws of physics, creatures that appeared without explanation, and phenomena that left even the most experienced scientists perplexed. "The universe is not made to be understood," he said once with a sad smile. "We can only try not to go crazy while looking at it." It was scary and fascinating at the same time. I wondered if Kevin believed we were so close to the unknown that we could no longer escape from it. A few weeks later, Kevin appeared with a look heavier than ever. He didn't have the brandy bottle that time, but he carried a briefcase full of papers. "I need to show you something," he said, almost whispering. Sat down in the usual chair and opened the folder, revealing photographs and reports. Some of the images were blurry, but enough to cause chills. One showed a humanoid creature with skin that looked like it was made of cracked glass. Another showed a dense forest with impossible footprints, huge and with a shape that reminded hands, but were clumsy, as if the creature who left them was not made to walk on Earth. "These are evidence that we're dealing with something much bigger than we can comprehend," Kevin said, his voice laden with seriousness. I asked why he was showing me that, and he was silent for a moment, as if he were choosing the words carefully. "Because you need to know that what happens here is not just science," he finally replied. "It's exploration. We are dealing with forces and intelligences that do not even recognize our rules or limits." He stopped and took a deep breath before continuing. "And deep down, I think they know that. We're not a threat to them. We're a curiosity." His words hit me like a punch. The idea that everything we are, our culture, our science, our existence, could be just a footnote to something much larger was almost impossible to process. After that conversation, Kevin seemed more distant. He still came to talk to me, but his visits were shorter, and he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder as if he was afraid of being heard. I knew something was changing, but had no idea what it would be. Then one night he appeared in my room with a small package wrapped in plain paper. "Keep it," he said, his voice almost without emotion. "It may be useful one day." Before I could ask what it was, he had already left. Inside the package was a small device, something that looked like a mix of a radio and a transmitter, but with engraved symbols I had never seen before. It was strange, but I knew that it was not something common. A few days later, Kevin disappeared. I asked the guards, but they just said he had been transferred. Their evasive manner told me there was more to the story, but I knew I would never get a clear answer. Not long after, I was taken from Fez and transferred to another location without explanation. To this day, I don't know why I was kept alive or why they let me out. The device that Kevin gave me is still stored in a drawer, and every now and then I look at it, trying to decipher what it means. Maybe it was the way Kevin told me that there was something else, something I still don't understand. And sometimes I think of the last thing he said to me: "If you ever find out, remember that we are not alone." We have never been. Kevin's sacrifice. It's not easy to talk about Kevin, because he was the only person in that place who reminded me that there was still humanity, even in an environment as inhumane as Fez. From the moment we met, there was something about him that looked different than other scientists. He didn't have that empty and calculating look. There was a kindness in his gestures, a genuine curiosity about people and, in this case, about me. I never had the courage to say everything I knew or where it really came from, but Kevin seemed to already know somehow. In the last few months I was at Fez, he started asking more direct questions, as if he was trying to confirm a suspicion. At first, I would talk out of it, but he wouldn't give up. "You're not who they think you are, right?" he once asked. The way he said it made me feel like I could trust him. What started as small conversations quickly turned into something more intense. Kevin seemed increasingly concerned, as if he knew that time was running out. He started bringing maps, small pieces of equipment, and eventually a plan. "They won't let you out alive," he said one night while drawing something on a piece of paper. It was a scheme to get me out of Fez. I laughed, incredulous. "You know they have eyes and ears everywhere, right?" He just nodded, but the look on his face was determined. "I won't let you rot here. You deserve better than that." Something in his tone was so serious that he can't argue. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope and fear. In the following days, Kevin began to act differently. He was more tense, but at the same time determined, as if he was putting everything in danger. He brought a piece of equipment that looked like an old radio, but with strange modifications. "This will mask your sign for a while," he said, as he adjusted the buttons with his trembling hands. I asked how he had gotten that, and he just shook his head. "You don't want to know," he replied, looking over his shoulder as if someone could come in at any moment. It was clear that he was putting his own life in danger for me, and it left me torn. Part of me wanted him to stop, not to take so much risk, but the other part knew that this was my only chance. The next night, he appeared in my room with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and determination. "It's all set," he said, handing me a small package. Inside were thermal clothes, a detailed map, and the radio that he had shown earlier. He began to explain the plan with almost surgical precision. "You will exit through the service tunnel in Sector D. They usually disable sensors for a few minutes during shift change. That's all you'll get. I asked what he would do, and he avoided my question. Don't worry about me, he said, as he pushed the package into my hands. I'll make sure they're busy enough for you to escape. It was at that moment I realized he knew exactly what he was doing, and that he probably wouldn't come out of it alive. When the time came, Kevin took me to the corridor that gave access to the service tunnel. He kept looking around, as if he expected someone to show up at any moment. Remember, follow the map and keep the radio on, he said as he checked my backpack for the last time. His voice was steady, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. Before I could ask him again what he would do, he put his hand on my shoulder. You only have one chance. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just go. Something in the intensity of those words made my heart race. I knew he was telling me not to come back, even if things went wrong for him. As I entered the tunnel, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the corridors above. Kevin had run out towards the main sector, shouting something to get the guards' attention. On the radio, I heard your voice trembling with adrenaline. They're coming after me. You're clean, keep going. My heart was racing as I ran through the narrow ice tunnel, holding the map tightly. The sound of boots hitting the ground and alarms ringing in the distance only made everything more surreal. I knew that every second counted, and that if I hesitated, everything would be in vain, including Kevin's sacrifice. As I ran through the tunnel, the cold seemed to cut my skin, even with the thermal clothes that Kevin had given me. The light of the lantern was shaking in my hand, and each step seemed heavier than the last. By the radio, I could still hear Kevin. He was deflecting the guards, making up stories about a problem in the main sector. Don't worry about me, I'm controlling, he said, but the panting breath and the approaching boot sounds in the background said otherwise. My instinct was to stop and come back, help him in some way, but I knew that it would only ruin everything. He had made it clear I needed to continue. The tunnel ended in a small exit, covered by a rusty metal grate. It took me longer than I should to remove it, my hands shaking so much that I almost let the flashlight fall. When I finally got it, I was greeted by a cold gust of wind and the darkness outside. It was Alaska in its cruelest form, snow and more snow, with no sign of civilization around. Follow the map as Kevin had instructed, radio still on. I heard his last seconds before everything went silent. You're free now. Go, he said, and then a loud sound, something like a gunshot, followed by a static hum. I shouted your name on the radio, but there was no answer. The silence on the radio was deafening. I wanted to believe that Kevin was still fine, that he would somehow escape, but deep down, I knew it was unlikely. I kept following the map, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other, even though each step seemed like a challenge. The cold was relentless, and the weight of what had just happened made it even more difficult. After hours of walking, I found the river that Kevin had marked on the map. I used the radio one last time, but only received static as a response. It was at that moment that I realized he had probably fulfilled his plan to the end, knowing there was no way out for him. I arrived at a small hut, exactly where Kevin said it would be. The man who received me seemed to know who I was, but didn't say much. He gave me food, a place to rest, and said I should be quiet for a few days. He mentioned that someone would come for me, but never explained who. During those long hours alone in the cabin, I was thinking about Kevin and the sacrifice he made. It was hard to accept that someone had risked, and probably lost, their own life to save me. I still didn't understand the exact reason, but I knew that what he did was more than an act of courage. It was an act of humanity, something rare in that place. After a few days in the hut, as the man had said, someone came to fetch me. It was a small group, discreet and organized, but clearly not part of any official force. They knew who I was and took me to a safe place, away from any radar. On the way, I asked about Kevin, but they just shook their heads as if his name meant nothing to them. Later, I found out that Kevin had been pronounced dead inside the Fez, and the official cause was suicide, a shot in the back of the head, according to the report that leaked. But I knew it didn't make sense. Kevin wouldn't have given up like that. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. That official conclusion only reinforced my certainty that the system eliminated him. To this day, I think about Kevin and what he stood for. He didn't have to do what he did, but he still risked everything for me. Maybe he saw something in me that I didn't see myself. The truth is, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. The radio he gave me, with its strange modifications, is still with me. I don't know exactly how or why it works, but I do know that Kevin believed I needed him for something bigger. Sometimes when everything is quiet, I just turn on the radio to hear the static, wondering if I will ever hear Kevin's voice again. If I have learned anything from all this, it is that his sacrifice was not in vain. He gave his life to give me a chance, and I will never forget it. The journey to freedom. That was the kind of cold that seemed to want to take your life. The kind that made the breath turn to ice before it even came out of your mouth. But there I was, crossing the absolute nowhere of Alaska with only a map, a backpack with basic supplies, and the instruction of a man who had given everything so that I could escape. Kevin said I had to head north, find a river, and then look for a small village. There, a man named Mr. White would be waiting for me. He said the man was reliable, but I could barely process the plan. Everything seemed so fragile, so improvised. However, I knew it was my only chance. As soon as I left the Fez tunnel, the vastness of the landscape hit me like a wave. It was all white and endless, with distant mountains that seemed impossible to reach. I looked at the map, trying to figure out where to go, but my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the flashlight. The radio that Kevin gave me was still with me, but I didn't know if I should use it or not. Each step seemed harder, as if the snow was conspiring to trap me there. The silence was deafening, except for the muffled sound of my footsteps and the icy wind. But it was when I heard something in the distance, a sound of helicopters, that the real dread began to settle. The helicopter sounds got louder and closer. They weren't looking for anyone, they were after me. Kevin had said that I would have a few minutes advantage, but it seemed like time was against me. I ducked in the snow, trying to blend into the environment. The thermal suit he gave me had a function to mask body heat, but I didn't know how long it could protect me. As I hid, I saw the beam of light sweep the area, illuminating the white vastness before me. My heart was racing, and every second felt like an eternity. When the lights finally went away, I took a deep breath and started walking again, trying to avoid the slightest sound. The wind seemed to mock me, throwing gusts against my face and making each step even more difficult. Following the map was not easy. The references seemed to move in my field of vision, and the snow covered any sign of the ground. After a while, I stumbled on something rigid, a piece of wood, perhaps part of an old structure. It was the only shelter I could find, a small pile of fallen logs that barely blocked the wind. I waited there for a while, trying to warm up, but I couldn't stand still for long. Looked at the radio and map once more, remembering Kevin's words. Follow the river. I got up, adjusted my backpack, and started walking again, still feeling the feeling of being watched. After hours of walking in the snow, I finally heard the sound of the river. It was a soft but constant noise, in contrast to the suffocating silence that surrounded me. As I approached, I saw the course of water partially frozen, with parts still flowing, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. It was a little relief to know that I was on the right track, but not it lasted a long time. The sound of footsteps in the snow behind me froze my blood. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, at least nothing I could see. The wind started to blow stronger, and I had the feeling that something or someone was following me. I rushed the step, trying not to look back, but each movement seemed heavier, as if the air was pressing me. As I followed the river, I saw something in the distance, a small light blinking on the horizon. My first reaction was of hope. Maybe it was the village that Kevin mentioned, but part of me knew it could be another trap. I had no choice. I kept walking, forcing myself not to stop, even though my legs were already screaming in pain. As I approached, I noticed that the light came from a small building, almost hidden by the snow. It was a cabin, just like Kevin had described. I came to the door, exhausted, and knocked hard, hoping someone would answer. The silence inside seemed endless, until I heard the sound of a lock being unlocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a man of austere appearance, with a thick coat and eyes that seemed to weigh every move. The man looked at me for a few seconds before saying, "You must be what Kevin sent." His voice was firm but not hostile. He made me enter quickly, closing the door behind me and locking it with several locks. The hut was small and full of scattered objects, weapons, maps, winter clothes hung on makeshift hooks. He pointed a chair at me near the fire, and I fell on it, feeling the heat begin to bring my frozen limbs back to life. "My name is White. I won't ask questions, and you shouldn't either," he said as he put a mug of something warm in front of me. Despite the hard tone, there was something reassuring about him. He knew what he was doing. While drinking the hot liquid, White took the radio from my backpack and adjusted some frequencies. "You're lucky to have come this far," he said without looking at me. "They are looking for you, but they won't risk too far in that region. The terrain is not favorable for them." He handed me a small bag with supplies and a thick blanket. "Rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you out of here," he said, before going outside to check something. I stood there, looking at the shadows that fire was projecting on the walls of the hut, trying to process everything. Although I was safe for now, the reality that Kevin was no longer there to help me hit me hard. He had sacrificed everything to give me this chance. The night in the hut was the longest of my life. The heat of the fire and the shelter were a physical relief, but my mind could not rest. Each crack of the wood burning in the fireplace made me think about Kevin and what he had faced to give me this chance. I tried to ignore the weight of guilt, but it was impossible. White came back inside a few hours later, bringing some more firewood. He sat down in the chair next to me and looked at me for a moment, as if he was evaluating whether I could handle what came before him. "You'll need to be faster than you were today," he said, almost as a warning. "The plan is simple. Head east into town. There, you will find who is waiting for you." Before bed, White handed me a small device. It looked like a tracker, but he explained that it was to deflect any signal the agents could pick up. "That will give you an advantage, but it doesn't solve everything. They're still out there, His words gave me a chill in my spine, but also a sense of urgency. I knew I could not stay in the cabin for long. During the early morning, I heard the wind rising outside, and along with it, sounds that could well be footsteps. White was on alert, holding a shotgun as if he expected something or someone to arrive at any moment. However, the night passed without incident, and as strange as it was, I knew that the calm was only temporary. The next morning, White woke me up early. The wind was still strong, but the sky was starting to clear. He put an updated map in my hand and gave me detailed instructions. You will leave now while the weather is still bad. That will make it difficult for them to track you. He pointed to the east and reminded me to follow the river until I reached the main road. There, someone would be waiting. Before I left, he put his hand on my shoulder. Kevin trusted you. Don't waste it. There was nothing more to say. I just nodded my head and left, with a heavy heart and still sore legs, but determined to continue. The road was brutal. The wind seemed to fight me at every step, and the cold made my hands and feet throbbing. At all times, I looked back, hoping to see some sign that I was being followed, but there was nothing, just snow and the sound of the river next door. After hours of walking, I saw the road that White had mentioned. A truck was parked there, with the engine running. The driver, a man with a closed face and a watchful eye, made a gesture to let me in. There was no conversation. As soon as I entered, he accelerated and we left. As I looked back, I saw the white vastness disappear in the rearview mirror, along with the weight of that place. I still didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. I was free, and that was only possible because of Kevin. The message to humanity. I never thought that writing this was so difficult. Part of me wants to forget everything that happened, leave it buried along with the place and people who stayed behind. But another part, the part that Kevin always believed I had, knows it needs to be told. Not by me, but by him. Kevin was more than a scientist in Fez. He was a person who, in an environment where humanity seemed to have been abandoned, managed to keep something that many of us lost: hope. He believed that knowledge, even the most dangerous, would necessarily be shared. And that is why he sacrificed everything. What I'm going to say here may seem crazy to some. I know that many will twist their noses, call a lie or conspiracy theory, but the truth is that there are things in this world that are so out of our understanding that we prefer to ignore them. When people talk about places like Area 51, they think of UFOs and military secrets, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real mystery is buried in places like Fez, places that never appear on maps, where the impossible is trained in silence. I am not asking you to believe blindly in me. I am asking you to think, question, and above all remember that the unknown is greater than anything we have ever imagined. Fez was not just a laboratory or a prison. It was a place where reality seemed to bend over itself. There I saw things that challenged everything I knew about science, nature, and even humanity. Creatures that should not exist, objects that should have their own goals, and characteristics that simply had no explanation. But above all, I saw the impact that these discoveries had on people. The scientists, the guards, all who worked there, just fragmented over time, as if they were close to something so incomprehensible was sucking their essence. Kevin was the only exception. He not only thought of that place, but also found a way to preserve something that Fez could not take away: his humanity. Kevin always said that knowledge should not be controlled by a few. He believed that the true strength of humanity was collective curiosity, in the ability to connect with the mysteries of the universe. "What we do here is wrong," he told me once. "We keep secrets that could change the way the world understands itself, but we prefer to protect power." It was this thought that led you to help me escape. He knew the system would never let me out alive, and yet he risked everything to make sure I had a chance. Kevin didn't believe in heroes, but that's exactly what he became to me, and everyone who cares about the truth. Kevin was more than a scientist, he was a visionary. He believed that if the world knew the truth about places like Fez, people would stop looking up for flying saucers and start looking around at the gaps in their own reality. "They are already here," he said once, referring to the possibility of intelligent life beyond our comprehension. "And what are we doing? Keeping all this in boxes, pretending that we can control the uncontrollable." For him, the true experts were not movie monsters, but perhaps poets, artists, or scientists who were already infiltrating our world, observing and trying to understand our complexity. It was this belief that gave meaning to Kevin's sacrifice. He knew that curiosity and fraud were the keys to unlocking greater mysteries, but he also knew that the price for it was high. When he transmitted that modified radio to me, I knew he probably wouldn't survive what came next. And yet he did. He told me to go, not to look back, but now I realized that the request was deeper than it seemed. He wanted me to do what he couldn't, tell the world that the truth is out there, far beyond any place we can imagine, and only fear prevents us from exploring. When I finally got out of Fez and took refuge with Mr. White, the reality of everything Kevin had done for me began to weigh. I looked at the radio he had modified, trying to understand what it represented. It was not just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol. Kevin had bet his life on the idea that knowledge should be shared, not hidden, and at that moment he realized he had a responsibility. The radio still worked, but the static coming out of it seemed more than just noise. It was like a constant reminder that Kevin was willing to go to the ultimate consequences so that at least some truth could escape from that place. After learning of Kevin's death, a suicide that no one near believed was real, the decision to share this story became even clearer. It's not just about honoring his sacrifice, but doing something he always believed was necessary, arousing people's curiosity. Everything I saw in Fez cannot be ignored. There are things beyond our comprehension, things that could change the way we see the world. Kevin taught me that truth is a burden, but it's also the only thing that connects us to what really matters. And even if the world does not believe, even if many choose to ignore, the message needs to be said. Today, as I write this, I know that many will dismiss these words as fiction or delusion. It is easier to believe that the world is simple, that places like Fez are just urban legends or exaggerated conspiracy theories. But I know what I saw, and I know what Kevin sacrificed so that this message could be heard. He was not just a scientist. He was proof that courage still exists, even in the darkest places. When I think of what happened in that place, I cannot ignore the impact that truth, however terrible it may be, can have. It's not about aliens or monsters, but how we choose to face the unknown. Kevin always said that humanity had a choice: live in fear of what we don't understand or accept the mystery as part of who we are. This choice is not easy, but it is necessary. So I am writing this now, not to shock or scare, but to remind us that the world is full of things we can't explain, and that this is beautiful, not threatening. Kevin's sacrifice was not just to save me. It was to show that curiosity, courage, and humanity, are the only things that really matter. I hope that whoever reads this feels the same as he wanted me to feel. An uncontrollable desire to seek more, to understand more. Before Kevin disappeared, he told me something that was etched in my mind. Truth is not a gift, it's a burden. But it's the weight that makes us human. At the time, I didn't quite understand what he meant, but now it makes perfect sense. He knew that what we were facing in Fez was not something a single person could carry alone. He knew that truth, however overwhelming it was, needed to be divided, spread. That's why I'm here writing this. Not because I think the world will change overnight, but because someone needs to start the conversation. And if no one else is willing to do that, then I will. The radio that Kevin gave me is still with me. Sometimes I call to hear the static, as if I'm waiting for some lost message from the other side. I know that I will probably never know everything Kevin knew, or everything that really happened in that place. But what I know is enough to understand that the world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than we could ever imagine. Kevin gave me the freedom, but also gave me the responsibility to carry his message. The truth is there, in places that do not appear on maps, and in questions that no one wants to ask. I hope this message inspires someone, whoever they are, to be like Kevin, curious, brave, and above all human.